All right, welcome back. This is kind of the second part to the interview I did with PJ and the rest of the creative team behind the Medal of Honor series. Today, I'm going to be talking to the writer Chuck Dixon. People may recognize him from some of his other works he's done with Marvel and DC and the other companies, but we're going to talk mainly about his work with the Medal of Honor, and then maybe we'll get into some of the other stuff. So let me just bring him in and introduce them.
Hey.
Good afternoon. Thanks for taking the time to talk.
Not a problem. Always happy to help.
So before we get into talking about the Medal of Honor stuff, I'd like to ask everybody if they remember how they got into comics, and if they remember like maybe the one comic book that that got them hooked.
Well, when I was a kid, comics were literally everywhere. If you went to visit someone's house and they had kids, there were comic books there. If you went to the barber shop, there were comic books. So it was a more of a pop culture medium than it is today, because the audience was saturated with comics everywhere. And I just, like so many comic creators, I was sick a lot as a kid. It's like we have shared origins, and so many comic creators discovered comics during a long illness when they were a child, and that's the same for me. Comics were an escape, a refuge, and I just became fascinated with the medium. And I guess Spider-Man's probably the comic that really hooked me. Early days Spider-Man.
Okay, and could you just tell us a little bit how you broke into the industry, and kind of what you've done since as your career has gone on?
It was mostly I always say a writer needs a lot of confidence and a lot of ignorance. And to get into comics took a lot of persistence. I was constantly going up for interviews and talking to editors at conventions and things like that. And I really didn't break into comics full time until I was like 32. So kind of a late bloomer for comics, but I think that really helped me out, because I worked a lot of dead end jobs, and I wrote in other mediums. And but comics were always my first love, and my continuous love. I am a comic book writer. Comics are not a stepping stone to screenplays or anything else. I just love comics. And my bona fides are, I was 11 years on Batman. I'm the co-creator of the Batman villain Bane. I was a seminal writer on The Punisher. I've written Savage Sword of Conan, SpongeBob SquarePants, Alien Legion, Moon Knight, Lone Ranger, The Simpsons. I've worked in every single genre. I am not a specialist.
Right. And as we were talking earlier, we were talking about some of the work that you did with Scott Beatty, who I interviewed about a couple months ago, and how you guys kind of made your mark on the characters of Robin and Batgirl, and some of those characters.
Yeah. Scott was a guy. He was working at Toy Fair magazine when I met him. And, a lot of people come to me and say, well, I'd like to write something with you, or I'd like writing advice. And I always say, look, I'll help you out, but you have to listen to every word I say and do what I tell you to do. And Scott was willing to do that. He was one of the rare guys who didn't question, didn't apologize, didn't make excuses. And he's a terrific natural talent. He is a terrific comic book writer. And I literally could not have done the Year One books without him. They would not have been anywhere near the quality they were, because the two of us together on that, there was, I hate the word synergy, but there was a real synergy.
Okay. So tell me a little bit about how you got involved with the Medal of Honor series.
Well, I don't know how Joseph got on to me, but I think I was recommended as a guy who would do the homework. And there is a lot of homework, although Joseph does most of the homework for me. He gives me all the official reports on the Medal of Honor winners and all the rest of it. But yeah, I mean, I think he picked me. I think I hope he's happy he picked me, because yeah, I'm willing to do the sweat work and the research and the rewrites and everything else that are entailed in a project like this, because I want it to be accurate and correct and impactful every bit as much as he does.
And so, besides the Henry Johnson one, who have you? Which Medal of Honor recipients have you done stories about?
We've done Sergeant York. That was our first one. We've done Audie Murphy, which was my favorite because he was a real hero to me when I was a kid. We've done Roy Benavidez, a Vietnam vet, whose story is just, all these stories are amazing, but his is particularly jaw-droppingly amazing. I don't know how he lived through the day that he won the Medal of Honor. We've done Henry Johnson, and we did one about a Civil War doctor, of the only female recipient of the Medal of Honor, and I'm trying to remember all the others. But we've done 8 so far. I've written eight. I think we've published 5 or 6. So
talk about the Henry Johnson one in particular. How was did you know anything about him going into the
I really
story?
I really didn't know anything about Henry Johnson. The story's fascinating. I mean, he was a guy who he volunteered to fight. And the conditions for an African American man in those days was, as you can imagine, a bit onerous. I mean, there wasn't much expected of them, and they were kind of given short shrift. They weren't even given American equipment when they went into the trenches. They were given French uniforms and French equipment, and they were deployed with the French because the American commanders thought that white American troops wouldn't serve with Black American troops. In nearby trenches and nearby deployments. They didn't want any tensions. And Blackjack Pershing, who was, the commander in the region, he had formerly commanded an all Black unit, the 10th Cavalry. So I think he knew what he was talking about as far as avoiding racial tensions when they were supposed to be fighting the Germans. He didn't want them fighting each other. So they deployed with the French. Was fascinating to me. And then Johnson's exploits, like so many of these Medal of Honor winners, it's like these guys were superheroes. I mean, there was something, the level of courage imbued on these guys, that they were able to call up on the day, because usually Medal of Honors are won for actions in one day, sometimes in just a few hours. And Johnson's ferocious defense of a forward position against overwhelming odds is simply astonishing. And again, that he lived is amazing. Although he did, suffer from his wounds for the rest of his life. But just an incredible story, and came home to be a hometown hero. With they had an enormous parade for him and everything else, which I don't know, kind of shows us, the good heart that Americans had. I mean, especially recently, we're talking a lot about systemic racism and the rest of it. But during a time period when race was definitely an issue and definitely a problem and definitely a conflict in American society, thousands and thousands and thousands of people turned out to cheer for this guy, of all colors.
Yeah.
So it's an inspiration. Like all of these stories, they're incredibly inspirational, and they basically make you hold your manhood cheap. You're like, wow, I couldn't have done that. I couldn't have done what these guys have done.
Yeah. So was this your first experience working with P.J. Holden and Troy?
Well, not with Troy. Troy was at CrossGen. He was the staff letter at CrossGen when I was there, so I'd worked with him before. PJ, no, I've never worked with before. And the first 4 of these were drawn by Rick Magyar, and I know him. He's a friend of mine. So, but he was picked independently. I mean, I don't know Joe's vetting process, but he got some terrific artists. He managed to, for a guy who's not a comic book guy, he found some terrific talent.
So, can you kind of explain the process that you did? Like, you would send them the scripts and they would write it, and then they'd is that how it worked? They'd come back to you if they had questions, or? Well,
on the first, Joe just lays out all of the documentation he can find, and then I have to dramatize it. I have to turn it into a comic story. Well, it's a basic war story. I mean, most of the story is about the day of that action. There's a little bit of a biographical introduction, and then we get into the actual action of the day for which they were awarded the Medal of Honor. And but we want to get everything right down. I mean, I'm a stickler for it too, down the weaponry and things like that. And what I learned on the Alvin York one was what a stickler Joe was going to be, because when I didn't know something, I just, it's comic books. I just kind of made something up to explain things that weren't explained in the documentation. And then Joe would find, he would say, well, I don't think that's the way it happened. It's not the way it happened in the documentation. And he would find me further documentation. And then in some cases, like in the Audie Murphy story, I did some research on my own, because the hardest thing about these stories is finding dialogue. And I don't want to make up dialogue. I want to have dialogue that they actually said. And so sometimes I'll look for, videos or actual autobiographical information in which they tell their story, so that I can find, things that they said on that day, or things that they actual quotes from them. Now, some of them may be apocryphal. I mean, there's one in the Audie Murphy story that he may have made up for his autobiography, but he wrote it. So maybe he did say it on that.
Yeah.
Because he was a bit of a wise ass. So it's conceivable that he said some of the things that I have him saying in the story, and he says he said them. So I'm not going to doubt Audie Murphy.
Yeah.
So that's the process.
So,
and then the story, my finished script, is shown to historians, and they go through it with a fine-tooth comb, and further corrections are made.
Okay. So what I'm sure there's a difference, and you've kind of touched on it before, or just then, but is there a difference between trying to write more of a history story based on history than, let's say, a superhero comic book?
Yeah, I mean, when you're doing nonfiction, you want to be as accurate as possible. I mean, even when I'm writing fictional war stories, I want the weaponry, ordnance, and dialogue and everything else to ring with authenticity. But here, there's no room for error. There's zero tolerance for anything that's wrong. I mean, I had the wrong weapon in Audie Murphy's hand on one page, and we had to change that. And then he uses that weapon later in the story, but he switched his small arms, his personal choice in small arms somewhere in his Army career. And but Joe caught that, and I'm glad. I mean, I don't mind doing the rewrites in the name of accuracy. I want the stuff to represent these heroes in the most accurate light. But yeah, when you're writing superhero, I mean, you're literally just making stuff up. I mean, just the wildest, craziest stuff you can imagine, which is, that's the fun of this job. I get paid to just daydream.
So, how long? I mean, the Medal of Honor comics are, I think they're about 8 pages. How long does it take you to, with all the research and all that, you have to actually, from start to finish, to write it?
Well, I take some time to absorb the research, and then it's probably 2 days to script it, which is slow for me. I can usually do 8 pages in a day, but again, that's if I'm making everything up. But a Medal of Honor story, I generally take 2 days to do the script, 4 pages a day, just to make sure I've got it all right. And then it's off to Joe, and then it might be another day of rewrites, and then it's off to the historians, and there might be like a half a day of changes there. So it's a full week on a whole 8-page story, I would say.
I'm sure it's a process.
Yeah, it's a unique. I've never been involved in anything like this, where where it's vetted over and over and over again.
And do you know if they have plans to collect them all? And I know I think they're initially digital, or going to be, if they're going to be collected for a paper print or trade or something.
Well, they printed the first 4 in a collection for the AUSA convention, and apparently they went like hotcakes. They just gave them away, and I don't know if there's plans to go public with them. I can't imagine they wouldn't. I mean, once we have 8 of these done, I mean, that's a fair-sized trade paperback, and as long as they're successful, and apparently they're very successful with AUSA members. I can't imagine they're not going to make them available to the general public. But for right now, you can read them for free online, which is cool.
Yeah, yeah, it is. And
but I'm like
again,
you.
I've been getting.
You're a comics fan. You want to be holding that thing in your hands. I'm the same way. I'm a comics fan too.
Yeah, I like the physical copies, but
yeah,
kind of take up space.
Right.
So, are you hoping that once you finish up the ones that you're currently doing, that there's more to do, because I'm sure there's more Medal of Honor winners.
Oh yeah. I'm on board as long as Joe wants to keep doing these, as long as they're popular. And I wish the Marines, Navy, and Air Force would have a program like this. I'd like to do something too. Because I was suggesting Medal of Honor winners to Joe, and he's like, "No, they're not Army. They're not Army. We're only doing Army."
Well, there's definitely room for spinoffs, I guess.
Yeah. The other services. Hey, I'm letting all the other services know, if you want Medal of Honor stories like this, I'm here. I'm ready. I'm rested and ready, and I'll do the research.
So, is there anything else that you're currently working on that you'd like to talk about or can talk about?
Well, I do a weekly comic strip for EdgarRiceBurroughs.com called Pellucidar. I've been doing it for 6 years. It's one of the best kept secrets in comics. me and Gary Quapis, we've been there every week for 6 years with a continuing epic story of the set at the Earth's core. And I always draw a blank on things I'm working on, because usually I'm working so far ahead of schedule. I'm working on projects I can't talk about. I'm starting to do stuff for Webtoons, the digital-only service, and I have a series coming out soon called Go Monster Go. And if you look on Amazon, I do write novels. I have a Levon Cade series and the Bad Times series. It's for anybody who's interested in some prose written by me.
Yeah. So is there a character, let's say, in any comic book universe or from any publisher that you haven't had a chance to write that you would really like to take a stab at?
Yeah, my standard answer to that is always the Fantastic Four. I've written a little bit of Fantastic Four, but I'd like to do an actual run on Fantastic Four. It's seeming less and less likely as the years go on, but that's always been a favorite title of mine. But I can't kick. I got to do long runs on a lot of. I never thought I'd write Batman. Here the bulk of my work is on Batman, so I can't complain.
Well, I've enjoyed. I'm mainly DC reader, so I've really enjoyed the stuff that you've done with the Batman family and stuff like that, because that's my that's kind of what got into comic books back around Nightfall era, and then I'm also a big Green Arrow fan.
Oh yeah, well yeah, I think I was 3 years on Green Arrow, so yeah, I enjoyed. I like the DC characters as well. I was a Marvel fan growing up, but I read DC too, and Batman. I mean, simply the most famous comic book character in the world. Get to work on that was pinch me, I'm dreaming every day.
So is there anything that I maybe didn't ask about the Medal of Honor series that you wanted to mention, or that I
pretty much covered it, except I think these stories are important, especially in a comic book form, and we make them really easily accessible, even if you're not familiar with how comics are read, but some people aren't. These are really produced for mass appeal, and I think it's important to show them to kids, because kids really need some kind of an introduction to history to make it interesting to them. And I think these make an excellent introduction, because they're all about average people, just people that otherwise probably never would have. I'm not going to say they wouldn't have distinguished themselves in life, but they might have been just a farmer or a shopkeeper or whatever. But these people rose up to become national heroes. And the thing about
real life heroes.
Yeah, yeah, and the thing about most of these guys is they weren't officers or anything else. They were either non-commissioned officers or just enlisted men who simply, met the challenge in the most astonishing way imaginable. And their stories really they need to be told and retold, because we should remember our history and remember that sometimes the worst of times bring out the best in people.
Well, I'd like to thank you once again for taking the time to talk to us about this, this the Medal of Honor series and everything else. And if whenever you want to, if you want to come back and talk about your webcomic sometime when it's
Sure.
ready to go, then you're more than welcome.
Absolutely. No, stay in touch, and we'll do this again. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and oh no, not a problem. It's great talking to you, and it's one of the, you're one of the creators that is on my list that I'd like to meet. And I luckily also got to meet and you Denny O'Neill before he passed. So that was. But no, you were, since being a Man fan and Green Arrow fan, you were one of the creators that I was really looking forward to interviewing. Now I have.
There you go. We got that one out of the way.
Well, and maybe if I don't know if you do cons, and if we're ever going to have a con again, but maybe we'll meet in real life.
It's debatable. We'll see what happens. This may be as close as we can get.
Yeah, well, that's enough for me. It's better than missing a chance to talk to you.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate
that. Again, take care, stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll be in touch about the other stuff, and hopefully we'll talk again.
I look forward to it.
All right. Thanks.
Yep.